In Tokyo's iconic dome, a 17-year-old martial artist was about to face the world's most ruthless champion. A ceremonial exhibition turned deadly when European MMA champion Viktor Orlov shattered a teenager's arm on live television. Steven Seagal wasn't your typical tournament guest. For decades, he was a martial arts grandmaster and cultural icon known for defeating world champions without throwing a punch. When Viktor Orlov turned the mat into a battlefield and mocked the audience with taunts of superiority, he had no idea he was provoking a living legend. Seagal stepped onto the mat with unshakable calm and delivered a masterclass in restraint that would echo far beyond the arena. What began as a showcase of technique would become a reckoning for an entire sport. The Tokyo martial arts world would never be the same after Steven Seagal stood up not to fight, but to teach the true meaning of power. Before we jump back and tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Tokyo Dome pulsed with electric energy as thousands of martial artists, fans, and cultural enthusiasts streamed through the entrances, their voices creating a symphony of languages and anticipation. The International Martial Arts Expo had transformed Japan's most iconic venue into a cathedral of combat sports, where ancient traditions would collide with modern spectacle. Massive screens displayed highlights from previous years, while vendors hawked everything from traditional weapons to energy drinks. The air itself seemed to vibrate with possibility. 17-year-old Daichi Sato adjusted his father's ceremonial black obi for the third time, his fingers trembling slightly as they traced the worn silk that had belonged to the man who taught him everything about honor and nothing about fear. "Uncle Kenji, this feels different than training." Daichi whispered, his voice barely audible above the crowd noise. His uncle sensei, Kenji Sato, stood beside him, weathered hands clasped behind his back, watching the stream of competitors and spectators with the measured gaze of someone who had seen decades of martial arts evolution. Different how nephew Kenji's voice carried the gentle authority that had guided Daichi through 6 years of rigorous training since his father's death in that terrible car accident that had shattered their family, but somehow strengthened their resolve. Daichi struggled to find the words. "It's not just the size of the venue or the cameras, it's like everyone here has something to prove, like they've forgotten why we really train." Kenji nodded slowly, his eyes finding the massive banners hanging from the dome's ceiling, each representing different martial arts disciplines from around the world. "You are not wrong, Daichi-kun. Modern competition has made spectacle more important than spirit, but that is why we are here, to show them what your father believed in, what our dojo still represents." Across the venue near the VIP entrance, a very different arrival was taking place. Viktor Orlov, the reigning European MMA and Sambo champion, strutted through the crowds, flanked by a small army of cameras, handlers, and sponsors. His custom-designed tracksuit gleamed under the arena lights, every step calculated to project dominance, and star power. Fans pushed against security barriers, hoping for selfies or autographs, while Orlov soaked in the attention like a man who had been starving for recognition his entire life. "This is what real martial arts looks like," Orlov declared to a cluster of microphones, his Russian accent thick with disdain as he gestured dismissively toward a group of traditional karate practitioners demonstrating kata in a nearby exhibition space. "All this ceremony and bowing, it is theater for children. Tonight, you will see what happens when pretty techniques meet ugly reality." His entourage laughed on cue, but several nearby martial artists exchanged uncomfortable glances, the traditional masters maintaining their composure despite the obvious provocation. Japanese-American sports journalist Hana Kuroda pushed through the media scrum, her press credentials and fluent Japanese helping her navigate the chaos. She had covered martial arts for 5 years, but this expo felt different, charged with an undercurrent of tension that made her journalist instincts tingle. "Mr. Orlov," she called out, her recorder held high, "what are your thoughts on tonight's exhibition matches against some of Japan's rising traditional artists?" Orlov's eyes lit up with predatory interest. "Exhibitions?" He laughed, the sound harsh and metallic. "These are not exhibitions, they are lessons in reality. I will show these traditionalists what their pretty forms are worth when they face someone who fights to win, not to look graceful." His gaze swept across the crowd, landing on several Japanese masters who were watching with barely concealed disapproval. "Your ancient ways are museum pieces. Tonight, I bring martial arts into the modern world." Meanwhile, at the far end of the arena, near the honored guests, Section Steven Seagal made his entrance with characteristic understated presence, no entourage, no fanfare, just a tall figure in a simple black suit moving with the fluid grace that had defined his Aikido practice for over 4 decades. Security personnel bowed respectfully as he passed, recognizing not just the Hollywood legend, but the legitimate 7th Dan black belt who had spent years studying in Japan. When such acceptance was rare for Westerners, Seagal's presence sent ripples through the crowd. Some whispered excitedly about his films, others discussed his controversial statements over the years, but the Japanese martial arts masters who approached him did so with genuine respect, bowing deeply and speaking in reverent tones about his contributions to Aikido and his understanding of Bushido philosophy. Seagal responded to each greeting with proper etiquette, his movements precise and mindful, even in casual interaction from the competitor's area. Daichi watched Seagal's arrival with fascination. Uncle, is that really Steven Seagal, the actor? Kenji followed his nephew's gaze, a slight smile crossing his weathered features. Yes, but more importantly, that is Steven Seagal, the Aikidoka. He spent many years in Japan learning our ways properly, not like the weekend warriors who come for photos and leave with certificates. Your father met him once at a demonstration in Kyoto, said he moved like water. Even then, as the opening ceremonies began, the Tokyo Dome's lights dimmed to dramatic effect. Spotlights swept across the arena, while traditional taiko drums thundered from speakers powerful enough to shake the massive structure. The crowd fell silent as a procession of martial arts masters from around the world entered the central ring, each representing their discipline with formal demonstrations that showcased decades of dedicated practice. But the reverent atmosphere shifted when Orlov was introduced, his entrance accompanied by pounding electronic music and pyrotechnics that seemed to mock the traditional ceremony that had preceded it. He raised his arms to the crowd, his smile predatory and confident, while photographers captured every angle. The contrast between his showmanship and the quiet dignity of the masters was stark and intentional. Daichi felt his stomach tighten as his own introduction approached. He had trained for this moment, dreamed of honoring his father's memory on this stage, but now surrounded by the circus atmosphere and Orlov's barely contained aggression, he wondered if he was ready for what was coming. Uncle, what if I'm not strong enough? What if I dishonor father's memory? Kenji placed a firm hand on his nephew's shoulder, his grip conveying strength and certainty. Strength is not about breaking your opponent, Daichi. It is about remaining true to yourself no matter what pressure you face. Your father's spirit lives in every technique you perform, every bow you make, every moment you choose honor over victory. Remember that when you step onto that mat. The announcement came over the PA system, calling competitors for the first exhibition match. Daichi Sato, representing traditional Aikido, and Kendo against Viktor Orlov, representing modern mixed martial arts. As Daichi rose from his seat, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him, the crowd's noise seemed to fade into a distant hum. All he could hear was his own heartbeat and his uncle's final words echoing in his mind. Show them the way your father taught you. Show them what real martial arts means. The walk to the central mat felt like crossing an ocean. Daichi's white gi, pristine and traditional, stood in stark contrast to Orlov's sleek compression gear designed for maximum mobility and intimidation. Under the blazing arena lights, the crowd's energy was palpable. Thousands of voices creating a wall of sound that pressed against Daichi's consciousness as he approached the ceremonial center, where two very different philosophies were about to collide. The referee, a veteran official who had overseen countless competitions, called both fighters to the center, his voice carrying the authority of decades in martial arts. Gentlemen, this is an exhibition match designed to showcase the beauty and technique of your respective disciplines. We expect controlled contact, respectful engagement, and demonstration of skill, not dominance. His eyes lingered on Orlov, whose reputation for excessive force was well known in competition circles. Daichi bowed deeply from the waist, his movements fluid and precise, exactly as his father had taught him. The bow was not mere ceremony, but a spiritual preparation, emptying the mind of ego and fear while honoring both the opponent and the art itself. Orlov's response was perfunctory, barely a nod of acknowledgement. His attention already focused on the cameras, capturing every angle of his chiseled physique and confident swagger. From the commentator's booth overlooking the arena, experienced martial arts analyst Kenji Watanabe spoke into his microphone, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years covering combat sports. What we're seeing here represents two very different approaches to martial arts. Daichi Sato embodies the traditional path, discipline, respect, and technical precision, while Viktor Orlov represents the modern evolution, power, athleticism, and aggressive application. Both have their place, but in an exhibition setting, the expectation is for artistry, not warfare. The opening moments seem to validate the exhibition format. Daichi moved with the flowing grace of Aikido, his techniques designed to redirect rather than oppose Orlov's initial attacks. When the Russian fighter threw a probing jab, Daichi stepped offline, his hands guiding the punch harmlessly past while maintaining perfect balance. The crowd murmured appreciatively at the demonstration of classical technique. Orlov circled his movements, predatory and calculating, testing his opponent's reactions, but something shifted in Orlov's demeanor as the exchange continued. Perhaps it was the crowd's positive response to Daichi's traditional techniques, or maybe it was his own insecurity masked beneath layers of bravado, but the controlled aggression he had promised began to escalate into something more dangerous. His strikes came faster and harder, each one pushing the boundaries of what constituted appropriate exhibition contact. Daichi adapted, as his training had taught him, using Orlov's increased aggression as energy to redirect his Aikido principles, allowing him to stay centered and responsive even as his opponent's intensity grew. When Orlov threw a powerful hook punch, Daichi executed a perfect Irimi movement, entering the attack's centerline and using a gentle but firm grip to off-balance his opponent. The technique was textbook perfect, drawing appreciative nods from the traditional masters in attendance, but Orlov's reaction was not what the crowd expected. Instead of acknowledging the skillful counter or adjusting his approach, he seemed to take it as a personal insult. His face darkened, and his body language shifted from competitive to aggressive. The exhibition rules and spirit of respectful demonstration seemed to evaporate from his consciousness, replaced by something darker and more personal. From the sidelines, Sensei Kenji watched with growing concern, his experienced eye reading the dangerous shift in energy. Orlov was no longer demonstrating martial arts. He was hunting. Something was wrong here. This was becoming personal. For the Russian fighter, who seemed unable to accept that traditional techniques could effectively counter his modern approach, Hana Kuroda, her press credentials allowing her ringside access, found herself leaning forward in her seat, her journalistic objectivity battling with genuine concern for the young Aikido practitioner. She could see Orlov's escalation and Daichi's attempts to maintain the exhibition's proper spirit, but the gap between their intentions was widening with each exchange. The turning point came when Daichi executed a particularly elegant technique. As Orlov rushed forward with a combination of strikes, the young Aikido practitioner used perfect timing and body positioning to blend with the attack, redirecting Orlov's momentum and sending him stumbling several steps before regaining his balance. The move was purely defensive, designed to neutralize rather than harm, but it clearly embarrassed the Russian champion in front of the massive crowd. Orlov's face flushed red, his professional composure cracking like a dam under pressure. Enough of this dancing, he snarled loud enough for the front rows to hear his voice, carrying a venom that sent ripples of unease through the audience. This is not martial arts. This is performance art. Let me show you what real fighting looks like. His stance shifted, completely abandoning any pretense of exhibition decorum. Daichi tried to maintain his center, his training emphasizing calm awareness even in the face of aggression, but he could feel the situation spiraling beyond his control or experience. Orlov was no longer following the unspoken rules of respectful demonstration. He was treating this like a professional fight with something to prove. The crowd sensed the shift to the appreciative murmurs, giving way to concerned whispers and some outright calls for the referee to intervene. But martial arts exhibitions often walked a fine line between controlled combat and actual conflict, and Orlov's escalation, while concerning, had not yet crossed into clear rule violations. Steven Seagal, from his position in the honored guests section, leaned forward slightly, his experienced eye immediately recognizing the dangerous trajectory the exhibition was taking. His decades of training and teaching had shown him countless times how ego and insecurity could transform martial arts from art into violence. His expression remained calm, but those who knew him could see the subtle tension in his posture. Orlov launched into a vicious combination, his strikes no longer pulled or controlled, but delivered with full intent to damage. Daichi's Aikido training had prepared him for aggressive attacks, but not for this level of malicious intensity. the young fighter found himself being pushed backward, his defensive techniques increasingly strained against an opponent who had abandoned all pretense of exhibition. Protocol. The crowd's concern turned to alarm as Orlov's attacks grew more savage and Daichi's responses became more desperate. The beautiful demonstration of contrasting martial arts philosophies was degenerating into something ugly and dangerous. The referee stepped closer, clearly considering intervention, but unsure of how to restore order without escalating the confrontation further. In the VIP section, Steven Seagal's hands rested calmly on his knees, but his eyes never left the mat. His Aikido training had taught him to read energy and intention, and what he saw developing in Orlov was something that went far beyond competitive spirit or even ordinary aggression. This was a man whose identity was so wrapped up in dominance that he could not tolerate any challenge to his superiority. Even in a friendly exhibition, the stage was set for disaster as two philosophies clashed, not in the spirit of mutual learning and respect that exhibitions were meant to foster, but in a confrontation between honor and hubris that would soon shatter the evening's careful choreography into something far more brutal and profound. The atmosphere in the Tokyo Dome shifted like a pressure drop before a storm. What had begun as cultural celebration was about to become something far darker. Orlov circled Daichi with predatory focus, his earlier pretense of exhibition decorum completely abandoned, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who had decided that humiliation was not enough. He needed to make a statement that would echo far beyond this arena. Daichi maintained his Aikido stance, his feet light and responsive, his center low and stable, but his breathing had quickened and sweat beaded on his forehead despite his years of training. Nothing had prepared him for an opponent who had abandoned not just technique, but basic human decency. The young fighter's attempts to redirect and neutralize were becoming increasingly desperate as Orlov's attacks grew more vicious and personal. From the sideline, Sensei Kenji rose from his seat, his weathered hands gripping the barrier as he watched his nephew struggle against an opponent who was no longer following any recognizable martial arts protocol. This was not sparring or competition, or even fighting. This was systematic brutalization disguised as sport, and every instinct in the old master's body screamed for him to intervene. Stop this, Kenji called out, his voice cutting through the crowd noise, but his words were lost in the arena's vastness and the growing chaos of spectators who were beginning to realize they were witnessing something that went far beyond acceptable competition. Orlov feinted left, then shot low, his wrestling background allowing him to close the distance and trap Daichi in a clinch that neutralized the Aikido practitioner's ability to use distance and timing to his advantage. For a moment, the two fighters were locked together, Orlov's superior size and strength becoming immediately apparent as he began to maneuver for a takedown. But Daichi's training served him well. Even in this compromised position, his father had taught him that Aikido was not just about pretty throws and joint locks, but about maintaining composure and finding the opponent's weakness. Even when everything seemed lost, the young fighter managed to create a small opening, shifting his weight and using Orlov's own momentum to break free from the clinch. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The escape was technically sound, but it put Daichi off balance for just a moment, and Orlov seized that opening with the ruthless efficiency of a predator. He caught Daichi's extended arm in a grip that was far from the controlled demonstration techniques they were supposed to be showcasing. This was a combat application designed to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. No, Hana Kuroda whispered from her ringside position, her journalist's objectivity crumbling as she realized what was about to happen. Her hands moved instinctively toward her phone to call for help, but events were unfolding too quickly for any intervention. The crowd fell silent as Orlov applied pressure to Daichi's trapped arm. The young Aikido practitioner's face contorting in pain as he felt bones and ligaments straining past their limits. He tried to tap out the universal signal of submission, but Orlov either didn't see or chose to ignore the gesture. His face set in an expression of cold satisfaction. Steven Seagal's entire body tensed, his Aikido training allowing him to read the biomechanics of the hold and understand exactly what was About to happen, his hands moved slightly forward as if to intervene, but the distance and crowd made any action impossible. All he could do was watch as decades of martial arts philosophy were about to be violated in the most brutal way possible. The sound when it came was sickeningly clear despite the arena's size, a wet crack that seemed to echo through the sudden silence, followed immediately by Daichi's scream of agony, a sound that cut through every pretense and civilized veneer to reveal the raw horror of deliberate cruelty. The young fighter collapsed to the mat, clutching his shattered arm, his white GI already staining with blood where bone had torn through skin. For a moment, the entire Tokyo Dome seemed frozen in shock. 70,000 people suddenly confronted with a reality that their entertainment had demanded, but their humanity couldn't accept. Then chaos erupted, screams of horror and outrage mixing with calls for medical assistance, while Orlov stood over his victim, raising his arms in victory, as if he had just won a championship. Instead of destroying a young man's future, Sensei Kenji vaulted the barrier with an agility that belied his age, reaching his nephew in seconds, his face a mask of controlled anguish as he knelt beside Daichi, whose breathing was shallow and rapid, signs of shock setting in from the trauma and pain. Hold on, nephew, help is coming. Your father would be proud of how you fought with honor. The medical team rushed onto the mat, their equipment and training immediately put to use as they stabilized Daichi's arm and prepared him for transport. But even their professional efficiency couldn't mask the severity of the injury. The unnatural angle of the limb and the amount of blood loss painted a picture that would haunt everyone present for years to come. Orlov finally seemed to realize that the crowd's reaction was not the adoration he had expected. Boos and shouts of disgust rained down from every section of the arena. But instead of showing remorse or concern, he grabbed a microphone from a stunned ring announcer, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's sound system. This is what happens when children play with adults, he declared, his accent thick with contempt. Your pretty techniques and ceremony mean nothing when faced with real strength. I came here to show you the future of martial arts, and this is what it looks like: power without apology, strength without sentiment, victory without compromise. The crowd's response was immediate and unanimous, a wave of revulsion and anger that seemed to physically push against Orlov's presence. Several spectators began moving toward the ring, while security personnel struggled to maintain order. But one figure remained perfectly still in the chaos. Steven Seagal sat in his honored guest seat, his expression unreadable, but his eyes never leaving the Russian fighter who had just violated every principle that martial arts were supposed to represent. Hana Kuroda found herself crying as she reported into her phone, her professional composure completely shattered by what she had just witnessed. This was supposed to be a celebration of martial arts culture and philosophy. Instead, we have just seen the deliberate destruction of a young man whose only crime was believing in honor and respect. The images of Daichi Sato being carried off this mat will haunt everyone who was here tonight. As the medical team wheeled Daichi toward the exit, his consciousness fading from shock and pain medication, the young fighter's eyes found his uncle's face. One last time, forgive me, uncle, I have dishonored our family and our dojo. Kenji walked alongside the stretcher, his weathered hand resting gently on his nephew's uninjured shoulder. You dishonored nothing, Daichin. You showed them what our family represents: grace under pressure, courage in the face of cruelty. That monster dishonored himself. The Tokyo Dome had become something else entirely in the span of those few terrible minutes, no longer a venue for cultural celebration, but a crime scene where the soul of martial arts had been publicly violated, and everyone present, from the traditional masters to the casual fans, understood that they had witnessed something that would change how they viewed combat sports forever. But in the VIP section, Steven Seagal finally stood, his movement drawing the attention of those around him, his expression calm, but carrying an undercurrent of something that made hardened security personnel step back instinctively. He had not spoken since the attack, but his presence seemed to fill the space around him with a gravitational pull that suggested the evening was far from over. The Tokyo Dome buzzed with an energy that felt nothing like the celebration that had filled it hours earlier. Shock conversations in multiple languages created a chaotic symphony, while security personnel struggled to maintain order amid the growing crowd of outraged spectators. Many demanded refunds, others called for arrests, and a significant number simply stood in stunned silence, trying to process what they had witnessed. Tournament Director Nobu Kondo found himself in an impossible situation. His carefully planned cultural showcase had become an international incident. In real time, his phone buzzed constantly with calls from sponsors, media outlets, and martial arts organizations around the world, all demanding explanations for how a friendly exhibition had turned into what many were already calling assault on live television. "We need to shut this down," Kondo told his assistant, his voice tight with stress. "Cancel the remaining matches, issue a statement expressing our shock and concern, and get our legal team on the phone immediately. We have 70,000 witnesses to what might be a criminal act disguised as sport," but the damage was already spreading far beyond the confines of the arena. Social media exploded with video clips of the attack taken from dozens of angles. Hashtags like Broken Honor and Justice for Daichi began trending worldwide. Within minutes, the brutal imagery of a young man's arm being deliberately shattered spread across platforms faster than any attempt at damage control could hope to contain. Hana Kuroda stood in a quiet corner of the press area, her hands shaking as she tried to compose herself enough to file her report. This story would define her career, but not in any way she had ever imagined. When she woke up that morning, she had expected to cover cultural exchange and athletic achievement. Instead, she was documenting the systematic destruction of everything martial arts were supposed to represent. The response on social media is unprecedented. She reported into her phone, her voice still unsteady. "Millions of people around the world are watching this footage, and the reaction is unanimous horror and outrage at what Viktor Orlov has done to a young man who embodied everything noble about martial arts tradition." In the medical facility beneath the arena, Daichi drifted in and out of consciousness, his shattered arm immobilized and his body fighting shock. While doctors worked to assess the full extent of his injuries, Sensei Kenji sat beside the bed, holding vigil, his weathered face showing every one of his 67 years as he watched his nephew struggle with both physical and psychological trauma. The attending physician, Dr. Tanaka, emerged from examining the x-rays, her expression grim as she approached Kenji. "The damage is extensive," she said softly. "Compound fracture of both the radius and ulna, severe ligament damage, possible nerve involvement. We can repair most of it, but his competitive career is likely over, and full function will require extensive rehabilitation if it's possible at all." Kenji closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. He had encouraged Daichi to accept this exhibition match, had seen it as an opportunity to honor his brother's memory and show the world what their family dojo represented. Instead, he had delivered his nephew into the hands of a monster who had no concept of honor or restraint. "I should have known," he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. "I should have seen what that man was capable of and protected Daichi from him. I have failed my brother and his son in the worst possible way." Meanwhile, Viktor Orlov strutted through the backstage area, seemingly oblivious to the horror and disgust his actions had generated among the staff and remaining competitors. His entourage had melted away, most of them uncomfortable with being associated with what was increasingly being characterized as deliberate assault rather than competition mishap. Whereas everyone, Orlov demanded of a production assistant who shrank back from his approach. "Where are the interviews, the photo opportunities one just gave them? The most memorable moment in martial arts history, and they act like I have done something wrong." The young woman stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, you broke that boy's arm deliberately. Everyone saw it. The whole world is watching video of you destroying a 17-year-old who was trying to demonstrate his art with honor and respect. How can you think this is something to celebrate?" Orlov's face darkened, his fragile ego unable to process the idea that his actions might be viewed as anything other then triumphant. "That boy learned a valuable lesson about the real world," he snarled. "Traditional martial arts are obsolete. I showed them what modern combat looks like when you stop pretending that honor matters more than victory." But even as he spoke the words, his voice carried a hollow quality that suggested even he was beginning to realize that the crowd's reaction was not what he had expected. The adoration and respect he craved were being replaced by universal condemnation, and his name was becoming synonymous with everything wrong with modern combat sports. In the VIP section, Steven Seagal remained in his seat long after most of the honored guests had departed, his expression calm, but his eyes holding a quality that made approaching him feel like walking toward a sleeping tiger. Several martial arts masters had approached him seeking his thoughts on what they had witnessed, but he had declined to comment, saying only that there was nothing yet to say, but those who knew him could see the internal process taking place, the decades of Aikido training and philosophical study that had shaped his approach to conflict and violence. His entire martial arts philosophy was built on the concept of neutralizing aggression without causing unnecessary harm, of using an opponent's force against them while maintaining one's own spiritual center. A young black belt from a local dojo finally worked up the courage to approach Seagal sensei. He said, bowing deeply, "What should we do? How do we respond to something like this? How do we honor Daichi-san and preserve what martial arts are supposed to mean?" Seagal looked at the young man for a long moment, his expression unreadable sometimes. He said finally, his voice carrying the weight of decades of experience, "The way forward reveals itself not through planning, but through being present to what is needed when the moment comes." As the arena continued to empty and the initial shock began to settle into grim determination among the martial arts community, it became clear that this incident would not simply fade into memory. The violation of trust and tradition was too profound, the injury to Daichi too severe, and the challenge to everything martial arts represented too direct for the community to simply move on and forget. But what form that response would take remained unclear until a figure who had remained silent and still throughout the chaos finally stood up, his movement drawing the attention of everyone remaining in his section. Steven Seagal's time for reflection was over, and his decision about how to respond to this assault on everything he had spent his life defending was about to become clear. The Tokyo Dome might have been quieting down, but the real confrontation was just beginning. The tension in the Tokyo Dome had settled into an uncomfortable quiet, broken only by hushed conversations and the distant sound of cleanup crews removing equipment from the earlier chaos. Most of the crowd had departed, but several thousand spectators remained, either unable to process what they had witnessed or unwilling to leave without some sense of resolution to the evening's horrors. The remaining martial arts masters clustered in small groups, their faces grave, as they discussed how to respond to what many were calling the darkest moment in modern competitive martial arts history. Viktor Orlov paced in the backstage area, his earlier bravado beginning to crack as he realized that his anticipated hero's welcome had transformed into something entirely different. His social media mentions were overwhelmingly negative. His sponsors were fielding angry calls, and several martial arts organizations were already discussing formal sanctions against him. The isolation was beginning to affect his carefully constructed image of invincibility, and his fragile ego couldn't tolerate the shift from adoration to condemnation. Unable to accept that his actions had been genuinely horrific rather than impressively dominant, Orlov made a decision that would seal his fate. He approached a production assistant still wearing his fighting gear and demanded access to the arena's sound system. Despite protests from tournament officials who wanted nothing more than to end the evening quietly, Orlov's celebrity status and contractual obligations gave him the leverage he needed to commandeer the microphone one final time. As he strode toward the center mat, the remaining crowd stirred uneasily, sensing that the night's ugliness was far from over. Spotlights followed his movement, while cameras reluctantly captured what everyone hoped would be an apology, but feared would be something far worse. Orlov's body language radiated the desperate aggression of a man whose carefully constructed identity was crumbling and who had decided that doubling down was preferable to admitting error. "Ladies and gentlemen," his voice boomed through the arena's sound system, carrying clearly to every corner of the vast space. "I see your faces and I hear your disapproval, but you are missing the point entirely. What happened here tonight was not tragedy, it was education. That boy learned what happens when traditional fantasy meets modern reality." The crowd's response was immediate, and visceral boos and shouts of disgust rising like a wave, but Orlov pressed on, his voice growing more strident as he fed off the negative energy. For too long, martial arts have been polluted by ceremony and mysticism, by old men teaching pretty movements that have no application in real conflict. I came here to show you the future, and I delivered exactly what I promised. His eyes swept the arena, searching for cameras and finding them before continuing his inflammatory monologue. "You want to honor tradition? Then honor the most important tradition of all. The strong survive, and the weak are eliminated. That is nature's law, and I am nature's representative." But then his gaze fell on the VIP section, where one figure remained seated with perfect stillness amid the chaos around him. Steven Seagal sat with his hands resting calmly on his knees, his expression unreadable, but his presence somehow dominating the space despite his complete lack of movement. For a moment, Orlov hesitated, recognizing something in the older man's bearing that triggered primitive warning signals. However, his desperation to reassert dominance overrode his instincts, and he pointed directly at Seagal, his voice carrying across the arena with deliberate provocation. "And you, Steven Seagal, sitting there like some wise sage, do you have anything to say? Or are you too old and too soft to defend these obsolete traditions? Your movies made you famous, but everyone knows Aikido is just dancing for people too weak to learn real fighting." The arena fell dead silent, 70,000 people holding their collective breath as they waited to see how the legendary martial artist would respond to such a direct and disrespectful challenge. Hana Kuroda moved closer to the action, her journalist instincts telling her that history was about to unfold before her eyes, while her human compassion prayed that whatever happened next would somehow restore balance to an evening that had gone so terribly wrong. Seagal remained motionless for several heartbeats, his breathing steady and his expression unchanged. Then slowly, deliberately, he stood. The movement was fluid and controlled, every muscle working in perfect harmony as 6 decades of martial arts training expressed itself in the simple act of rising from a chair. The effect on the crowd was immediate, whispers and gasps rippling through the arena as people realized they were about to witness something extraordinary. "Mr. Orlov," Seagal's voice carried clearly, without amplification, his words measured and precise. "You have demonstrated tonight what happens when martial arts are divorced from their spiritual foundation. You have shown us strength without wisdom, power without restraint, and technique without honor." Orlov's face flushed red, his carefully maintained composure cracking as he realized he had just challenged a man whose reputation for quiet lethality was legendary even among Hollywood exaggerations. "Are you going to lecture me, old man, or are you going to step onto this mat and prove that your ancient philosophy means anything in the real world?" The challenge hung in the air like a physical presence while Seagal moved toward the arena floor with the same fluid grace that had characterized his rise from the chair. Each step was precise and purposeful, neither hurried nor hesitant, as if he were simply walking across his own dojo rather than approaching a confrontation that would be witnessed by millions around the world. "I accept," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, "not to prove anything to you, but to honor a young man whose spirit you tried to break, and to remind everyone present what martial arts actually represent." As Seagal approached the mat, the atmosphere in the Tokyo Dome shifted once again, but this time the change felt like sunrise after a long, dark night. The remaining crowd pressed forward, sensing that they were about to witness not just a physical confrontation, but a philosophical reckoning that would define the soul of martial arts for a generation. The Tokyo Dome's lighting shifted as both men approached the center mat, the harsh glare that had illuminated Orlov's earlier brutality giving way to a softer, more focused illumination that seemed to highlight the profound differences between the two fighters. Orlov bounced on his toes, his muscles tense and coiled like springs waiting to explode into violence, while Seagal moved with the fluid certainty of water, finding its level every step, economical and precise. The contrast between them was striking in more than just physical presence. Orlov's fighting gear was designed for maximum intimidation, sleek compression garments that showcased his physique and bore the logos of sponsors who were probably already reconsidering their associations. Seagal wore a simple black GI, the traditional uniform unmarked by commercial considerations and somehow more imposing for its very simplicity. Tournament officials had long since abandoned any pretense of controlling the situation, security personnel maintaining a respectful distance, while medical staff stood ready for whatever might unfold. This was no longer an exhibition or even a sanctioned competition. It had become something deeper and more primal, a confrontation between two fundamentally different philosophies of what martial arts should represent. "No referee," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying clearly in the hushed arena. "This is not a competition, Mr. Orlov. It is an education, and the only rules that matter are those written in the heart of every true martial artist." Orlov's response was to settle into a combat stance, his weight distributed for explosive movement his hands positioned for striking or grappling as situation demanded. His training was evident in every line of his body, the product of years spent learning to hurt people efficiently and without remorse. Stop talking, old man, and show me what your pretty art can do against someone who fights for real. But Seagal did not assume any recognizable fighting stance, instead standing naturally with his hands relaxed at his sides, his posture upright, but not rigid. To untrained eyes, he might have appeared vulnerable or unprepared, but experienced martial artists in the crowd recognized the position as Mushin, the state of no mind where conscious thought gives way to pure responsive awareness. Orlov circled looking for an opening, his predatory instincts fully engaged as he sought to identify weaknesses in his opponent's seemingly casual positioning. His earlier confidence was intact, but something about Seagal's complete calm was unsettling, making him hesitate when he should have pressed forward. The older man's eyes tracked his movement without apparent effort, and his center remained perfectly balanced regardless of which angle Orlov approached from. Unable to tolerate the psychological pressure any longer, Orlov exploded forward with a combination that had ended many professional fights, a powerful jab followed immediately by a devastating hook designed to overwhelm opponents before they could respond. The attack was textbook perfect in terms of modern MMA technique, explosive and committed with enough force to drop most men instantly. Seagal's response seemed almost supernatural in its simplicity. As the jab approached, he shifted his body just enough to let the punch pass harmlessly by his head while simultaneously stepping into the attack's centerline. His movement was so minimal and so perfectly timed that observers in the upper sections missed it entirely, but those close to the action saw Orlov's powerful strike slice through empty air while Seagal ended up inside his guard. The hook that followed met a similar fate, Seagal's hand rising to intercept Orlov's wrist, not with blocking force, but with a gentle redirection that sent the Russian fighter stumbling past his intended target. What should have been a devastating combination became an exercise in futility as Orlov found himself off balance and out of position while his opponent remained perfectly centered. "This is not possible," Orlov muttered, his confidence shaken by the ease with which his best techniques had been neutralized. He reset his stance and tried again, this time with a low kick designed to sweep Seagal's legs while setting up a takedown attempt that would allow him to use his size and strength advantages. But again, Seagal's response was minimal and devastatingly effective. He lifted his front foot just enough to let the kick pass underneath while his weight shifted to accommodate the movement without losing balance. When Orlov shot forward for the takedown, Seagal was no longer where he expected to find him, having moved just far enough to make the grappling attempt miss while positioning himself perfectly for a counter. Hannah Kuroda watched from ringside, her cameraman capturing every moment of what was rapidly becoming the most educational martial arts demonstration any of them had ever witnessed. "What we're seeing here," she whispered into her microphone, "is not a fight in any conventional sense. Steven Seagal is demonstrating the fundamental principles of Aikido, using an opponent's force and aggression against them while maintaining perfect composure and control." The crowd began to murmur appreciatively as they realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Orlov's attacks grew more desperate and wild as his frustration mounted, each failed technique chipping away at his carefully constructed image of invincibility. He threw everything he had learned in years of professional training, powerful strikes, innovative combinations, and creative grappling attempts, but nothing seemed to work against an opponent who moved like smoke and water. After several minutes of this one-sided education, Orlov paused, breathing heavily and staring at Seagal with a mixture of confusion and growing fear. "How are you doing this? Your techniques are obsolete, your philosophy is weakness, and you are old enough to be my grandfather. This cannot be happening." Seagal remained perfectly calm, his breathing unchanged despite the constant movement required to neutralize Orlov's attacks. "Mr. Orlov, you are fighting against yourself, your own anger, your own need to dominate and control. Aikido does not oppose force, it redirects it. Your strength becomes my strength, your aggression becomes your weakness. This is what you could never understand through violence alone." The lesson was becoming clear to everyone present, including Orlov himself, whose worldview was crumbling with each failed attack. He had built his entire identity on physical dominance, on the ability to impose his will through superior technique and conditioning. But here was a man 30 years his senior who was making him look like a beginner not through superior athleticism, but through understanding principles that transcended mere physical capability. Impossible, Orlov snarled, launching himself forward in a desperate all-out assault that abandoned technique for pure aggression. I will not be made a fool of by an old man and his fairy tale philosophy. But as his final desperate attack unfolded, Seagal's response would demonstrate once and for all why true martial arts mastery has nothing to do with breaking opponents and everything to do with understanding the deeper principles that govern conflict itself. Orlov's final assault came with the desperate fury of a man whose entire identity was collapsing in real time. He abandoned all pretense of technique or strategy, throwing everything into a wild combination of strikes and grappling attempts that would have overwhelmed most opponents through sheer savage intensity. His face contorted with rage and humiliation, as he committed every ounce of his strength and speed to destroying the calm figure who had made his life's work look ineffective. The attack was genuinely dangerous not because of its sophistication, but because of its complete abandon. Orlov threw punches, kicks, elbows, and knee strikes in rapid succession, while simultaneously attempting takedowns and submission holds. It was the kind of berserker assault that had ended many professional fights through overwhelming aggression and refusal to accept defensive responses. But Steven Seagal moved through the chaos like a master calligrapher creating art with minimal brushstrokes. Each of Orlov's attacks was met with precise redirection, subtle footwork, and perfectly timed body movement that turned aggression into empty air. The older man's hands seemed to barely touch his opponent, yet somehow every strike was deflected, every grappling attempt neutralized, and every moment of the assault turned into an opportunity for demonstration. The crowd fell completely silent as they watched Seagal demonstrate what true martial arts mastery looked like. This was not the flashy choreography of movies or the brutal efficiency of cage fighting, but something deeper and more profound. The application of principles that transcended physical technique and entered the realm of pure understanding. Orlov's desperation reached its peak as he realized that nothing he did seemed to affect his opponent. With a roar of frustrated rage, he launched himself forward in a final reckless charge, intending to tackle Seagal to the ground, where he could use his size and strength advantages. It was an attack born of panic rather than strategy, but it carried genuine threat through sheer commitment and aggression. Seagal's response was poetry in motion. As Orlov charged forward, the Aikido master stepped slightly to the side while his hands moved with surgical precision. One hand guided Orlov's momentum while the other found a pressure point on his wrist. The Russian fighter found himself suddenly airborne, his own force redirected and amplified until he crashed to the mat with stunning impact. But Seagal was not finished. As Orlov tried to rise, the older man moved with fluid grace, applying a joint lock that was both gentle and absolutely inescapable. The technique was applied with perfect control, bringing Orlov to the edge of serious injury without crossing that line. The Russian fighter found himself face down on the mat, his arm extended and completely vulnerable, while Seagal knelt beside him with calm precision. The arena held its collective breath as everyone present realized they were witnessing a moment of perfect karmic justice. Here was Viktor Orlov, who had deliberately shattered a young man's arm, now finding himself in exactly the same position, completely at the mercy of an opponent who had every justification for delivering identical punishment. The parallel was so perfect it seemed scripted, but the tension was absolutely real. Orlov's eyes widened with genuine terror as he felt the pressure building in his trapped arm. He knew exactly how much force would be required to break bone and ligament, and he could feel that his opponent possessed both the skill and the leverage to deliver that force. For the first time in his adult life, he was completely helpless, facing the same fate he had inflicted on young Daichi. "Please," he whispered, his voice barely audible, but carrying clearly in the silent arena. "Do not break my arm. I surrender. I submit completely. I was wrong about everything." The crowd leaned forward, expecting to see Seagal apply the pressure that would give Orlov a taste of his own medicine. Justice seemed to demand equivalent retaliation, and the symmetry of the situation provided perfect justification for delivering the same injury that had been so callously inflicted on an innocent young man. But Steven Seagal's next action would demonstrate why he had devoted his life to Aikido rather than more aggressive martial arts. Instead of applying the devastating pressure that everyone expected, he gently released the hold and stepped back, allowing Orlov to roll away from danger. The Russian fighter scrambled to his feet, clutching his uninjured arm and staring at Seagal with a mixture of confusion, gratitude, and shame. "Mr. Orlov," Seagal said quietly, his voice carrying clearly through the arena's perfect silence, "martial arts is not about crushing those who oppose us. It is about understanding that true strength lies in choosing not to cause unnecessary harm, even when we have the power to do so. You had the ability to demonstrate your skills without breaking that young man's arm, but you chose cruelty over restraint. I have the ability to give you the same injury, but I choose a different path." The impact of these words on the crowd was immediate and profound. Spontaneous applause began in the traditional martial arts sections and spread throughout the arena, as people realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just a demonstration of physical technique, but a living example of the philosophical principles that separated true martial arts from mere violence. Orlov collapsed to his knees, the weight of his shame finally overwhelming his ability to maintain his aggressive facade. Everything he had believed about strength and dominance had been proven wrong in the most public way possible, while the man he had mocked and challenged had demonstrated a form of power that transcended anything Orlov had ever imagined. "I do not understand," he said, his voice broken and hollow. "You could have ended my career, destroyed my arm, made me suffer as I made that boy suffer. Why did you not take your revenge when you had the chance?" Seagal looked down at the defeated fighter with an expression that held no triumph or satisfaction, only a deep sadness for how far martial arts had fallen from their true purpose. "Because revenge is not the way, Mr. Orlov. Martial arts exist to protect the innocent, to defend the weak, and to demonstrate that wisdom is stronger than brutality. If I had broken your arm, I would have become what you are, and the lesson would have been lost." The crowd rose to its feet in sustained applause, not the savage cheering that had followed Orlov's earlier violence, but the respectful acknowledgement of witnessing something profound and transformative. They had come expecting entertainment and spectacle, but had instead seen a demonstration of the highest principles of martial arts philosophy applied in real time with perfect effectiveness. As the applause continued, Orlov remained on his knees, head bowed in complete defeat, while Seagal stood over him not as a conqueror, but as a teacher whose lesson had finally reached its intended recipient. The evening that had begun as cultural celebration and descended into brutality had somehow transformed into something deeper and more meaningful than anyone could have anticipated. The Tokyo Dome emptied slowly, as if the 70,000 spectators were reluctant to leave the sacred space where they had witnessed something that transcended ordinary sporting events. Conversations buzzed with an energy entirely different from the horror that had followed Orlov's assault on Daichi. Small groups of martial artists and fans processing what they had seen, while maintenance crews worked around them, preparing the venue for its return to normal commercial use. But nothing about this evening had been normal, and everyone present understood that they had been part of something that would be discussed, analyzed, and referenced for decades to come. The footage of Steven Seagal's demonstration was already spreading across social media platforms, but unlike the viral horror of Orlov's earlier attack, these videos were being shared with reverence and deep appreciation for the philosophical depths they revealed. Viktor Orlov sat alone in a quiet corner of the arena, his earlier entourage having melted away once his invincibility was so thoroughly shattered. The man who had strutted into the Tokyo Dome as a conquering champion was now isolated and forgotten, his sponsors already distancing themselves from the controversy and his reputation in ruins. But more than his career prospects, what had been destroyed was his entire sense of self, the carefully constructed identity that had sustained him through years of professional violence. Hana Kuroda found herself in the unusual position of having too much story rather than too little. Her editor was demanding immediate coverage of what was already being called one of the most significant moments in modern martial arts history, but she struggled to find words adequate to capture what she had witnessed. This was not just a demonstration of technique. She spoke into her recorder while reviewing footage of Seagal's masterful display, but a living embodiment of martial arts philosophy applied in the most challenging circumstances possible. Steven Seagal faced a man who had publicly mocked his art, challenged his reputation, and violated every principle of martial honor, and his response was to demonstrate why those principles matter more than individual ego or desire for revenge. Several traditional martial arts masters had approached her seeking to share their perspectives on what they had witnessed, and their words carried the weight of decades spent studying the deeper meanings behind physical technique. Master Yamamoto, an elderly karate instructor with over 50 years of experience, spoke with tears in his eyes. In all my years of training and teaching, I have never seen such a perfect demonstration of what we call winning without fighting. He told Hannah, Seagal-sensei did not defeat Orlov through superior technique alone, but through superior understanding of what martial arts actually represent. He showed us that true strength lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to choose restraint even when destruction would be justified. As the crowd continued to disperse, security personnel maintained a respectful distance around Steven Seagal, who remained near the center mat speaking quietly with several Japanese masters who had approached him with deep bows and obvious reverence. His demonstration had not just neutralized Orlov's aggression, but had somehow restored balance to an evening that had nearly destroyed the credibility of martial arts as anything more than sanctioned violence. Seagal-sensei, one of the approaching masters, said with perfect formal courtesy, "Please accept our gratitude for what you have done tonight." That young man's suffering was not in vain if it led to this demonstration of true Bushido spirit. Seagal's response was characteristically measured, his words chosen with the same precision he had applied to his physical techniques. The suffering was unnecessary and wrong, but sometimes darkness must be acknowledged before light can be appreciated. Mr. Orlov lost himself in the pursuit of dominance and forgot that martial arts exist to elevate human character, not to destroy it. Perhaps this experience will help him remember what he once knew. A young reporter managed to approach close enough to ask the question that was on everyone's mind. Seagal-sensei, do you regret stepping in tonight? Some people might say this wasn't your fight to fight. For the first time that evening, Steven Seagal's composure showed a hint of something deeper than calm philosophy. When I was young, I came to Japan to learn not just physical techniques, but the spiritual principles that give those techniques meaning. I learned that martial arts carry an obligation to protect those who cannot protect themselves and to preserve the honor of the traditions we inherit. Tonight, that young man was attacked not just physically, but spiritually, his belief in the value of traditional martial arts deliberately targeted for destruction. Under those circumstances, remaining silent would have been a betrayal of everything I was taught. The interviewer pressed further, clearly hoping for some dramatic declaration or promise of future action, but Seagal's response remained true to the philosophical approach he had demonstrated throughout the evening. There is no victory here tonight, only a lesson taught and hopefully learned. Mr. Orlov will have to decide for himself whether he chooses to understand what happened or continues down a path that leads only to isolation and eventual self-destruction. As the formal interviews concluded and the media attention shifted to analyzing footage and preparing comprehensive coverage of the evening's events, Seagal made his way toward the medical facilities where Daichi was recovering from surgery. His presence in the healing space where physical and spiritual wounds were being tended seemed appropriate, given how the evening had evolved from celebration to catastrophe to unexpected redemption. The walk through the arena's corridors gave him time to reflect on what had transpired and what it might mean for the future of martial arts in an increasingly commercialized and violence-obsessed culture. He had not sought confrontation with Orlov, but had been unable to stand by while everything he valued was publicly mocked and violated. The demonstration that followed had been necessary, but he took no pleasure in having been forced to provide it. Behind him, the Tokyo Dome continued its transformation back to an ordinary venue, but the events that had unfolded within its walls would continue to resonate far beyond its physical boundaries. Videos of both Orlov's brutality and Seagal's response were already being analyzed by martial arts instructors around the world, many of whom saw in the evening's events a perfect case study in the eternal struggle between power and wisdom, violence and restraint, ego and humility. The stage was set for the most important encounter of the evening as Steven Seagal prepared to meet the young man whose suffering had catalyzed everything that followed and whose future would depend largely on how he processed the trauma he had endured and the lessons that had emerged from it. The medical facility beneath the Tokyo Dome had been transformed into something resembling a field hospital, with equipment and personnel that seemed far beyond what any sporting venue should require. The sterile white walls and antiseptic smell stood in stark contrast to the arena's electric atmosphere, creating a sanctuary where the evening's violence could be properly addressed both physically and emotionally. Daichi Sato lay in the recovery bed, his shattered arm immobilized in a complex array of surgical hardware that would define the next year of his life. Dr. Tanaka had worked for 3 hours repairing the damage Orlov had inflicted, her surgical skill managing to restore structural integrity to bones that had been deliberately destroyed. But even her expertise couldn't erase the psychological trauma that accompanied such a deliberate act of cruelty, and she watched with concern as her young patient struggled with emotions that no 17-year-old should have to process. The physical healing will take time, she explained quietly to Sensei Kenji, who had maintained his vigil throughout the surgery. But the emotional recovery may take much longer. He keeps apologizing, as if what happened was somehow his fault rather than the result of facing a man who had abandoned all honor and restraint. Kenji nodded grimly, his weathered face showing the strain of watching his nephew suffer while feeling helpless to prevent it. The guilt weighed heavily on his conscience. He had encouraged Daichi to accept this exhibition match, seeing it as an opportunity to honor his late brother's memory and demonstrate the values their family dojo represented. Instead, he had delivered his beloved nephew into the hands of a predator who viewed martial arts as nothing more than sanctioned brutality. When the soft knock came at the door, both men looked up to see Steven Seagal standing in the entrance, his presence somehow filling the small space despite his quiet demeanor. He had changed from his GI into a simple dark suit, but his bearing remained unchanged, calm, centered, and radiating the kind of authentic power that came from decades of genuine understanding rather than mere physical capability. Sensei Sato, Seagal said, bowing respectfully to Kenji. I hope you will forgive the intrusion, but I wanted to check on your nephew's condition and offer whatever support might be helpful during his recovery. Daichi's eyes widened as he recognized the man who had just provided the most educational martial arts demonstration in modern memory. Despite his pain medication and emotional exhaustion, he attempted to bow from his hospital bed, his respect for what Seagal represented overriding his physical discomfort. Seagal-sensei, Daichi whispered, his voice hoarse from the trauma he had endured. I am honored by your presence, but I fear I have dishonored the very traditions you defended tonight. I was not strong enough to protect myself or represent my family's dojo with the courage my father would have expected. Seagal moved closer to the bed, his movements fluid and purposeful despite the confined space. When he spoke, his voice carried the gentle authority of someone who had spent decades teaching students to find strength in themselves rather than in dominance over others. Daichi-san, he said, pulling a chair close to the bed and sitting with the same precise economy of movement that had characterized his earlier demonstration. You have done nothing that requires forgiveness or brings shame to your family. What happened tonight was not a failure of your technique or courage, but the result of facing someone who had lost all connection to the spiritual foundations of martial arts. The young man's eyes filled with tears as he struggled to reconcile Seagal's words with his own feelings of inadequacy and failure. But I could not defend myself, sensei. All those years of training, all the techniques my father taught me, and when it mattered most, I was helpless against someone who simply refused to follow the rules of honorable combat. Seagal leaned forward slightly, his expression combining compassion with the kind of deep understanding that could only come from someone who had faced similar challenges throughout his own martial arts journey. Tell me, Daichi-san, what did your father teach you about the true purpose of martial arts training? Was it to become invincible in combat, or was it something deeper? Daichi considered the question carefully, his mind working through pain, medication, and emotional exhaustion to recall the lessons that had shaped his understanding of what martial arts should represent. He taught me that we train not to defeat others, but to improve ourselves, that the strongest victories are those won without fighting, and that true martial artists protect the weak and honor their opponents. And did you honor your opponent tonight? Seagal asked gently. I tried to, Daichi replied, his voice growing stronger as he remembered his behavior during the exhibition. I bowed respectfully. I attempted to demonstrate technique rather than dominate, and I never abandoned the principles he taught me, even when Orlov began escalating the violence. Seagal nodded approvingly, his expression showing the kind of satisfaction that came from seeing a student understand a difficult lesson. Then you succeeded completely in everything that truly matters. Your father would be proud not because you won or lost, but because you maintained your integrity under the most challenging circumstances possible. Sensei Kenji had listened to this exchange with growing emotion, watching his nephew begin to process the trauma in a healthier way. Under Seagal's gentle guidance, the older American's presence seemed to carry healing properties that went beyond mere words, offering a perspective that could only come from someone who had truly mastered both the physical and philosophical aspects of martial arts. Seagal-sensei, Kenji interjected softly, my nephew has always dreamed of competing at the highest levels, of honoring his father's memory through tournament success. Now that dream seems impossible, and I fear he may lose his connection to martial arts entirely if he cannot find a new purpose for his training. Seagal turned his attention to the older sensei, recognizing in Kenji's concern the deep love and responsibility that bound teachers to their students across generations. Sensei Sato, competition is only one expression of martial arts, and perhaps not the most important one. Some of the greatest masters I have known never competed publicly, but influenced thousands of students through their teaching and example. Asterisk. He turned back to Daichi, his voice taking on the quality of someone sharing hard-won wisdom. Your injury will heal, though it may limit certain physical capabilities. But what you demonstrated tonight, maintaining honor and respect even when facing deliberate cruelty, is a form of strength that very few people ever develop. That strength can inspire others, teach others, and preserve the true spirit of martial arts for future generations. Daichi absorbed these words slowly, his young mind beginning to grasp possibilities he had never considered. You mean that, even if I cannot compete anymore, there might still be ways to honor my father's memory and continue his teachings? I know there are, Seagal replied with quiet certainty. The techniques your father taught you are important, but they are only the beginning. The character he helped you develop, the principles he instilled in you, the way you respond to adversity, these are the true gifts he left you, and they are gifts you can share with others regardless of whether your arm ever regains full function. The room fell silent as all three men contemplated the profound shift in perspective that was taking place. What had begun as a conversation about healing from trauma was evolving into something deeper, a recognition that sometimes the most devastating setbacks can become the foundation for entirely new forms of contribution and purpose. Dr. Tanaka entered quietly to check on her patient, but she immediately sensed the changed atmosphere in the room. The despair and self-recrimination that had characterized Daichi's earlier emotional state had been replaced by something more complex, but ultimately more hopeful, a beginning understanding that his worth as a martial artist and as a person extended far beyond his performance in competition. Seagal-sensei, Daichi said finally, his voice carrying a strength that hadn't been there at the beginning of their conversation. When I am ready to return to training, would you be willing to visit our dojo? I think my uncle and I both have much to learn about the deeper aspects of martial arts that you demonstrated tonight. Seagal smiled for the first time that evening, his expression radiating the kind of genuine warmth that came from seeing a young person choose growth over bitterness in the face of trauma. It would be my honor, Daichi-san. Your father's legacy lives on in you, and I suspect he would be very proud of the man you are becoming. 6 months had passed since that transformative night at the Tokyo Dome, and the morning mist hung low over the modest courtyard of the Sato family dojo, creating an atmosphere of reverent tranquility that perfectly captured the essence of what martial arts could represent when practiced with proper spirit and intention. The wooden building that had housed 3 generations of disciplined training stood unchanged from the outside, its weathered timber and traditional tile roof giving no indication of the profound metamorphosis taking place within its sacred walls. Daichi Sato stood before a class of 15 young students, his left arm bearing the subtle scars and limited mobility that would forever remind him of that night. when violence had tried to crush the spirit of traditional martial arts, but had instead catalyzed something far more meaningful than anyone could have anticipated. The 17-year-old who had once dreamed of tournament glory had evolved into something his father could never have imagined: a teacher whose authority came not from competitive achievement, but from understanding forged in the crucible of genuine adversity. "Watch Yuki-chan," he said gently to a 10-year-old girl whose coordination challenges made even basic movements difficult, but whose determination reminded him daily why martial arts existed in the first place. "The kata is not about perfection of form, but about conversation with your own spirit. Each movement should carry intention and respect for those who came before us. Speed and power will develop naturally when your heart is properly aligned." The young student slowed her movements, focusing on the precision and mindfulness that Daichi emphasized rather than the flashy techniques that dominated modern martial arts competitions around the dojo. Other children practiced with similar attention to character development, their training informed by a philosophy that had been dramatically vindicated that night when restraint had proven more powerful than aggression and wisdom had triumphed over brute force. Sensei Kenji observed from his traditional position near the family shrine, his pride in his nephew's development evident in every line of his weathered face. The past 6 months had brought challenges he had never anticipated as the dojo found itself at the center of international discussions about the soul of martial arts. Journalists, documentary filmmakers, and practitioners from around the world had sought interviews and demonstrations, all wanting to understand how traditional values could remain relevant in an increasingly violent and commercialized sporting environment. But more importantly, the dojo had attracted a steady stream of families whose children had been inspired by Daichi's example of maintaining honor under impossible circumstances. Many of these young students came from backgrounds where bullying and cruelty were constant threats, and their parents sought not just self-defense instruction, but character development that would help their children navigate a harsh world while keeping their integrity intact. The door chime announced an arrival, and Kenji looked up to see Hana Kuroda entering with her camera operator and a figure whose presence immediately commanded respectful attention from everyone in the dojo. Steven Seagal had returned as promised, though his visit had been delayed by Daichi's insistence that he come not as a celebrity making a charitable appearance, but as a fellow martial artist ready to engage in genuine learning and teaching. The class fell silent as they recognized the legendary figure who had captivated the world with his demonstration of true martial arts principles. But Seagal's demeanor immediately restored the proper training atmosphere. He bowed respectfully to Sensei Kenji, then to Daichi, and finally to the assembled students, his movements carrying the same fluid precision that had made his confrontation with Viktor Orlov a masterclass in applied philosophy. "Please continue your practice," he said softly to the children, his voice carrying gentle authority that somehow made them feel more confident rather than intimidated. "I am here to learn as much as to share, and the best way to understand a dojo's spirit is to observe its daily cultivation of character rather than any special performance." Daichi resumed his instruction, but now with the added dimension of demonstrating not just to his students, but to one of the world's most respected martial artists. The pressure might have overwhelmed someone less mature, but the past 6 months had taught him that the most important teaching happened when ego was set aside in favor of genuine service to others. The young instructor worked patiently with Hiroshi, a 12-year-old boy whose earlier aggression problems had led his parents to seek martial arts training as an alternative to medication or therapy rather than channeling the boy's anger into more efficient violence. Daichi helped him understand how strength could be expressed through protection of others and mastery of oneself. "Very good, Hiroshi-kun," Daichi encouraged as the boy executed a technique with newfound precision and control. "See how much more effective your movement becomes when you work with the principles rather than against them. This is one of the most important lessons martial arts can teach us, that true power comes from harmony, not from forcing our will upon others." Seagal watched this interaction with obvious appreciation, recognizing in Daichi's teaching method the same principles that had guided his own decades of study in Japan. The young man understood intuitively that martial arts instruction was ultimately about developing human potential rather than creating more efficient fighters. After the class concluded and the students departed With their parents, Seagal approached Daichi with an expression of genuine admiration. Your teaching reminds me of my own sensei in Japan many years ago. You understand that martial arts education is about cultivating character and wisdom, not just physical technique. That understanding usually takes decades to develop, but you have found it through facing genuine adversity. Daichi bowed gratefully, his respect for Seagal's opinion evident in his careful attention to every word. Seagal sensei, I have learned more about the true meaning of martial arts in these past months than in all my previous years of training. What happened that night showed me that technique without character is meaningless, and that the strongest victories are often invisible to outside observers. Hana Kuroda had been documenting this interaction for her follow-up story, but now she set aside her professional role and spoke as someone who had been personally transformed by the events she had witnessed. Daichi-san, when I first met you at the Tokyo Dome, you were a talented young competitor, focused on honoring your father through tournament success. Now you seem to have discovered a completely different way to preserve his legacy. How do you feel about that transformation? Daichi considered the question carefully, his hand unconsciously moving to touch the memorial photo of his father that held a place of honor in the dojo. Hana-san, I think I misunderstood what my father was trying to teach me. For many years, I thought honoring his memory meant duplicating his competitive achievements and surpassing his tournament records. But what happened that night showed me that his real gift was not his fighting ability, but his character and his commitment to preserving the true spirit of martial arts. He gestured toward his scarred arm, which no longer seemed like a symbol of failure, but rather a reminder of important lessons learned. This injury ended my competitive career, but it opened a path I had never considered. Teaching these children, seeing them develop confidence and integrity through martial arts training feels more meaningful than any tournament victory I could have achieved. Sensei Kenji approached, carrying a traditional tea service that he had prepared according to ancient customs. As they settled around the low table that served as the dojo's informal meeting area, he addressed Seagal with the respect due to an honored guest and fellow guardian of martial arts tradition. Seagal sensei, we are grateful for your visit and for what you accomplished that night at the Tokyo Dome. But I am curious about your perspective on how that incident has affected the broader martial arts community. Has anything meaningful changed, or was it simply a moment of drama that will be forgotten as public attention moves to other stories? Seagal accepted the tea with proper ceremony before responding, his words carrying the weight of someone who had spent decades observing the evolution of martial arts culture. Sensei Sato, I believe that night represented a genuine turning point, though perhaps not in the dramatic way most people expected. Viktor Orlov's actions forced the martial arts community to confront some uncomfortable truths about how far we had drifted from our founding principles. He paused to appreciate the tea, his expression thoughtful as he considered the broader implications of what had transpired. The response has been more encouraging than I initially hoped. I have received hundreds of messages from instructors around the world who say they have refocused their teaching on character development rather than competitive achievement. Traditional dojos that were struggling to attract students in an MMA-dominated culture are finding renewed interest from parents who want their children to learn the values that Daichi demonstrated. Hana leaned forward, her journalist instincts engaged by this broader perspective. What about Viktor Orlov himself? Have you heard anything about how he has processed what happened that night? Seagal's expression became more complex, showing both concern and cautious optimism for the man who had catalyzed such profound change through his destructive actions. Mr. Orlov disappeared from public view immediately after that evening, canceling his remaining professional obligations and voiding his promotional contracts. I received a letter from him several weeks ago, a handwritten note not typed or dictated, in which he expressed genuine remorse for his actions and asked for guidance about how he might begin to understand the principles he had violated so thoroughly. This revelation surprised everyone present, as media coverage had largely written Orlov off as an irredeemable figure whose career and reputation had been permanently destroyed by his own choices. The possibility that he might be genuinely seeking redemption added another layer of complexity to an already profound story. I responded to his letter. Seagal continued and suggested that he begin by studying the philosophical foundations of martial arts rather than focusing on physical training alone. True change must begin in the mind and heart before it can manifest in technique or behavior. He has since enrolled in a traditional monastery in Tibet, where he is learning meditation and studying Buddhist principles that inform authentic martial arts practice. Daichi absorbed this information with the mature perspective that his ordeal had forced him to develop. Seagal-sensei, do you think it is possible for someone who has fallen so far from the path to find their way back to genuine understanding? I believe redemption is possible for anyone who is genuinely committed to transformation, Seagal replied, but it requires abandoning ego completely and embracing humility, which may be the most difficult challenge any martial artist can face. Mr. Orlov built his entire identity around dominance and superiority learning. To find worth in service and character development rather than in defeating others will require him to become a fundamentally different person. As the afternoon progressed, their conversation expanded to include the broader challenges facing martial arts in the modern world, the commercialization of combat sports, the emphasis on spectacle over substance, and the difficulty of preserving traditional values in an increasingly aggressive culture were all topics that had gained new urgency following the Tokyo Dome incident. The question, Sensei Kenji observed, is whether the martial arts community can use this moment as a catalyst for meaningful reform, or whether the attention will fade and we will return to the same patterns that created the problem. Initially, Seagal's response reflected both optimism and realism about the challenges ahead. Change in any community happens gradually through the accumulated efforts of individuals who choose to embody the values they wish to see preserved. Daichi-san is already contributing to that transformation through his teaching. Your dojo is demonstrating that traditional values can attract students and create meaningful impact. These individual efforts will eventually reach a critical mass where the entire culture begins to shift. As evening approached and the time came for Seagal to depart, he made a request that surprised everyone present. Rather than offering to provide additional resources or support, he asked if he could return periodically, not as a visiting celebrity, but as a regular student seeking to deepen his own understanding of the principles the Sato family had preserved across generations. I have spent decades teaching and demonstrating martial arts around the world, he explained, but that night at the Tokyo Dome reminded me that true mastery is not a destination, but a continuous journey. Your dojo represents something pure and authentic that I want to be part of preserving and learning from. 1 year later, as cherry blossoms bloomed in the dojo's courtyard and Daichi led his expanded class of 25 students through morning practice, his injured arm had regained most of its function, though it would never be quite the same. The walls now displayed photos documenting the dojo's transformation, including images from that pivotal night at the Tokyo Dome that had become symbols of martial arts values transcending competitive achievement. Among these photos was one that had become particularly meaningful to everyone associated with the dojo: Steven Seagal in a simple white gi, sitting in traditional Seiza position beside Daichi, as the young instructor explained a subtle point of Aikido philosophy to a group of attentive children. The image captured perfectly the cyclical nature of martial arts learning, where students become teachers and masters remain students, all united in pursuit of understanding that extends far beyond physical technique. As his students departed that morning, and the dojo settled into its characteristic peaceful silence, Daichi stood before his father's memorial photo, no longer seeing it as a reminder of expectations he had failed to meet, but as inspiration for a path he had never imagined but now followed with complete dedication. The way of honor had proven to be not about winning or losing, but about choosing character over convenience, principle over popularity, and service over self-interest. The Tokyo Dome incident had ended his competitive dreams before they truly began, but it had opened a doorway to something more profound and lasting in teaching others to find strength in restraint, wisdom in humility, and victory in maintaining their integrity regardless of external pressures. Daichi Sato had discovered the most important martial arts lesson of all: that true power lies not in the ability to break others, but in the capacity to heal what has been broken and preserve what is precious for future generations. The way of honor continued, carried forward by those who understood that the most important battles are fought not in arenas or on mats, but in the daily choice to embody values that make martial arts worthy of preservation and study. And in a quiet dojo in Tokyo, that choice was being made every day by a young man whose greatest victory had come not through defeating an opponent, but through refusing to be defeated by the worst that an opponent could inflict. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.